So, at the very beginning of the Gentile world empires, the dreaming comes to reveal the course of the Gentile world dominion. What did the future hold for the people of God? The Jews needed to know the answer to these questions, and God gave them this information through Nebuchadnezzar's dream. God still had a program for the Jews. This Gentile time of dominion was only an interlude in the history of the Jews. God had not cast him off his chosen people permanently. Pastor, can you read verse 2, or you are in the middle of something? Okay. When a king is upset, especially a tyrannical king like Nebuchadnezzar was, he will do something about his troubling dream, which generally will not be a nice, courteous action. Nebuchadnezzar certainly did do something about his dream. Nebuchadnezzar made some demands upon the wise men, which eventually participated in the crisis of Daniel's life. The king demanded. The king did what any ancient ruler would do. He summoned his special advisors to help him understand the significance of this dream, and had interpreted this sleep and had interrupted his sleep and robbed him of peace. Unfortunately for Nebuchadnezzar, he did not have much help from his counselors. The people who formed these four groups were conducting themselves according to worldly practices. As we will see, they were totally inadequate for the situation at hand. Nebuchadnezzar did not learn anything about his dreams until a man from God came along. Nebuchadnezzar needed some better advice. Nebuchadnezzar had 4 excellent advisors from the Hebrews, but they were not in the group which showed up before the king in his calling. The group called to help the king were comprised of magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, and Chaldeans. The magicians were those who practiced magic. That is, they practiced all the superstitious rites and ceremonies of fortune-telling. Astrologers were men who pretended to foretell future events by the study of the stars. Sorcerers were individuals who pretended to hold communication with the dead. The sorcerers used potions and drugs and claimed to possess supernatural power or knowledge gained in this manner, but especially through the aid of evil spirits, of which modern spiritualism is an example. Charles Larkin indicated in his book of Daniel that the Chaldeans were a sect of philosophers who made the sciences their special study. This was the class that Daniel and his companions belonged. The name Chaldeans was also used at times to represent the whole group, and the name was also used to designate a race of people referring to the Babylonians. In Genesis 11:31, we see that Abraham was from the Ur of the Chaldeans. For to show the king his dreams, the wise men came immediately and stood before the king. The wise men came to explain to Nebuchadnezzar the importance of the dream. Daniel was not in this group of counselors or wise men that appeared before Nebuchadnezzar. Why was Daniel and his 3 friends not included in this original group which appeared before the king? So glad you asked that question. The most apparent reason would be jealousy of the others. When the call went out to appear before the king, the other wise men would not tell Daniel and his 3 companions. The rest of the Chaldeans were jealous when they heard how well Daniel and his 3 companions had done before Nebuchadnezzar. Back in chapter 1, verse 20, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers. So, out of jealousy, they simply did not include Daniel in this group. Since Daniel and his 3 companions lived separately from the other men, as we will see in verse 17, this would be easy to keep Daniel and his 3 companions uninformed. The older men of the Chaldeans would simply not pass the word along to them. The wrath of man often accomplishes the purposes of God. So God used his absence of Daniel to his advantage. Larkin says, God's hand doubtless was in all of this? Nope. He first wanted to show up the false claims of those heathen systems represented by the wise men of Babylon and have them confess their incompetency. If Daniel had been called first, the wise men would have escaped this test. Why did Nebuchadnezzar not miss Daniel? There's another good question. The answer to this is that Nebuchadnezzar was too upset to notice in a group of several wise men who was and who was not present. Nebuchadnezzar wanted answers. He was not interested in taking a roll call. With all Nebuchadnezzar's business as king, he may have already forgotten about Daniel and his 3 companions. Mark, verse 3, please.
And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream.
Nebuchadnezzar awoke in alarm, remembering that something solemn had been presented to him in a dream, without being able to recall the dream fully. Nebuchadnezzar's thoughts on the unprecedented greatness to which his power had attained made him anxious to know what the issue of all of this meant. God meets his wish in the most calculated way to impress Nebuchadnezzar. John, verse 4, please. In Syriac, this was the Chaldean tongue and was the language tongue of the king and his court. This was not that much different from the Chaldeans, except this seemed to be more eloquent, and therefore the learned used this language. Live forever. This was a wish for long life, health, and prosperity. This was the usual form of salutation to kings in the eastern nations. Pastor, verse 5, please.
The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me, you will not make known unto me the dream, with the interpretation thereof, ye shall possess it, and your houses shall be made dunghill.
This was no routine meeting, for Nebuchadnezzar not only commanded them to interpret the dream, but also to reveal the dream to him. Ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. This is pretty cruel language for considering the times. This was normal, though. Kings in those days, like the evil dictators of our day, had little respect for human life. They would kill someone at the drop of a hat. If you did not do both, Nebuchadnezzar would kill them without mercy and turn their homes into public latrines and garbage dumps. This, of course, was a new challenge for them, and they knew they could not meet the challenge. Why this bizarre behavior? Was this simply a result of Nebuchadnezzar's frustration in not being able to understand the recurring dream? Nebuchadnezzar had become suspicious that these so-called wise men were not as wise as they claimed to be. This may be why he accused them in verse 9 of conspiring to report to him lying and corrupt words. This strong indictment seems to reflect an intense lack of trust that had either been building over the period of, or perhaps resulted from something that had just happened, which we are not told about. Whatever the circumstances, Nebuchadnezzar was so irate and offended, he was out of control. This would be like President Biden ordering a death sentence for every member of Congress and then commanding his assassins to use bulldozers to level the houses in which they lived. The English translation of the text suggests that Nebuchadnezzar forgot the dream and so wanted the wise men to recall the dream for him. Nebuchadnezzar had made up his mind irrevocably that he will settle for nothing less than the recalling of his dream by the counselors. An argument for this is the fact that Nebuchadnezzar had to know the dream if he was going to be able to know if the wise men were accurate in telling him his dream. If Nebuchadnezzar does not remember the dream, then a fraud could invent the dream, and Nebuchadnezzar would have no way of refuting the fraud. This request by Nebuchadnezzar evidenced his suspicion that these wise men were not altogether honest, which he was right. They were a bunch of frauds. The wise men figured that if the king would tell them the dream, they could agree on some interpretation that would seem plausible and save their reputation. This was inconsistent with their claim that they possessed occult powers and could get superhuman information. From this standpoint, the king's demand that they reproduce his dream was not unreasonable. The interpretations of this dream was too important for the king to treat the dream as a routine matter. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to be sure that the wise men would give him the correct meaning, for his future was involved in this dream. When the king saw that they could not reproduce his dream, he lost all confidence in their claim. Mark verse 6, please.
But if ye show the dream and the interpretation thereof, ye shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and the interpretation thereof.
If you show the dream and the interpretation thereof, which Nebuchadnezzar was extremely intent upon to know, and therefore makes use of every way to obtain the interpretation of the dream, first by threatenings to terrify, and next by a promise to allure. Ye shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. This is what the wise men of Nebuchadnezzar were chiefly interested in, and what motivated their fraudulent ways. This would be gold, silver, jewels, rich apparel, houses, lands, and great promotion to some of the highest places of honor, trust, and profit in the kingdom, as Daniel afterwards received. Show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. This was to be done at once without any delay, for the king was impatient for the interpretation. Juliet, verse 7, please.
They answered again and said, Let the king tell his servant the dream, and we will
Show. This was certainly not an unreasonable request in any circumstance, and especially in theirs. They did not profess to be able to recall a dream that was forgotten, but the extent of their profession this subject appears to have been that they were able to explain what was commonly regarded as a prognostic of a future event. King Nebuchadnezzar asked a strange and rare thing of the wise men. Nebuchadnezzar not only asked the wise men to interpret the dream, but he demanded that they tell him the dream. Nebuchadnezzar's magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers were trapped. If they had all been truly wise, they would have admitted any conspiracy and misleading behavior, bowing low before the king and begging for mercy. Instead, they accused Nebuchadnezzar of being unfair. They tried to cover their own mistakes by blaming the king, which was the biggest mistake. John, verse 8, please.
The king answered and said, I know of certainty that ye will gain insight, that ye see the thing is gone from you.
I know of certainty. I see plainly and clearly what you are at, and I am fully assured you mean nothing but that ye would gain the time. Nebuchadnezzar means either that they had wished to prolong the time so that he might remember the dream or forget about the dream, or that they might invent an interpretation of the dream or make their escape to save their lives after they packed their valuables. Because ye see the thing is gone from me. The dream Nebuchadnezzar could not remember, or because of the decree, was certain, which he had determined concerning them. Pastor, verse 9, please. Here is more proof of Nebuchadnezzar's suspicion. Nebuchadnezzar says that if they cannot recall the dream, then they are indeed a bunch of fakers who would lie to him about an interpretation if he told them the dream. Nebuchadnezzar does not hesitate to condemn them strongly for their lack of integrity. One wonders if the interview with Daniel and his three companions did cause Nebuchadnezzar, because of the great contrast between the 4 Jews and the other wise men, to begin suspecting that these professed wise men were not so wise after all. We get mixed signals for Nebuchadnezzar here. He had perceived the excellence of Daniel, but did not seem to realize that Daniel was missing. If Daniel was so good, why did Nebuchadnezzar not seek Daniel about these dreams? However, the problem of Nebuchadnezzar's mixed actions here is solved by the fact that Nebuchadnezzar has been very upset by this dream and in rage. The attitude of mind does not encourage good reasoning. But if you will not make known unto me the dream, for the present Nebuchadnezzar does not insist upon interpretation, only the dream itself, concluding that if they could do the one, they could do the other. There is but one decree for them all, and that was the decree of death, which should never be revoked or mitigated, or the sentence be changed for another, but should certainly be executed, and in which they were all involved, and not one should escape, till the time be changed, until a new state of things arrive, either by Nebuchadnezzar ceasing to be troubled about the dream, or by a change of government, which perhaps the agitation caused by the dream made Nebuchadnezzar to foretell, and so to suspect the Chaldeans of plotting. Tell me the dream, and I shall know that ye can show me the interpretation. For by being able to tell the dream that was past, they would be able to tell what was to come, signified by his dream. If they could not declare what was past, how could they foretell things to come? Nat, verse 10, please.
The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, There is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king or ruler that asks such things as any magician or astrologer or Chaldean.
There is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. This was quite a confession. This was a very embarrassing confession because they acknowledged by the confession that they could not tell the dream. This went against their occult claims that they had supernatural powers and understanding. They wanted to be known as those who could discern where others could not. But here the king called their bluff. They were no better than anyone else. To cover up their failure, they said, no man upon the earth could tell the king his dream. They were wrong, of course, because Daniel told the king his dream. However, like many in the world who overvalue themselves, they think that if they cannot perform the task, then no one can perform the task either. The king was right in his suspicion of these people. They were truly frauds, trying to pass themselves off as something they were not. There is no king, lord, no ruler that asks such things as any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. The wise men in their complaining were chiding Nebuchadnezzar for asking them to recall his dream. They chided him by saying no other ruler had ever made a request like this before. Their chiding was like a good deal of discretion, as they did not come right out and rebuke Nebuchadnezzar directly. Rather, they rebuked Nebuchadnezzar indirectly by simply mentioning that no other ruler had ever done this before. Mark verse 11, please.
There is a rare thing that the king there is none other that can show it before the king except the gods whose dwelling is not in flesh.
This was a wise conclusion to admit that only Jehovah God could reveal the dream. These wise men of Babylon did not speak as theologically sound as Bible-believing fundamentalists of our day would, for they did not have good theology about God. However, they were right in recognizing that only Jehovah God could reveal the dream. However, this indicated that they had no power with the gods. Their confession indicated that they could not communicate with the gods to obtain this knowledge. This would be embarrassing too, for this revealed their inability to communicate effectively with the gods. This was another statement which revealed their fraudulent claims of supernatural wisdom. The complaint of the wise men was followed by Nebuchadnezzar's decree to slay the wise men. The wise men acknowledged their inability, and while they wanted to make that acknowledgement as honorable as possible, this did not go over well with Nebuchadnezzar at all. As far as Nebuchadnezzar was concerned, their complaint condemned them to death. They were useless to Nebuchadnezzar. Juliet, verse 12, please.
For this cause the king was angry and very furious, and commanded to destroy all the wise men and
The king was angry and very furious. Some of this anger can be blamed upon the unrestrained temper of a despot, a ruler who wielded absolute and often contemptuous and oppressive power. However, some of the anger can be justified. After all, the king had provided for these wise men. They had a prestigious position with him. Now they have let Nebuchadnezzar down. In doing so, this exposes them as frauds. So Nebuchadnezzar has several reasons for his anger. First, he is angry because he cannot get his troubling dream interpreted. And secondly, he is angry because these wise men, whom he has supported well via the king's funds, have through their own confession admitted their fraudulent character. Commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. This is where the crisis of Daniel begins. Though Daniel was not among the wise men who were present before Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel was still included in this decree. For Daniel had recently become a member of this group after his examination before Nebuchadnezzar. Furthermore, there would be others included in the decree who did not come before Nebuchadnezzar, as all the wise men of Babylon were included. Many of these wise men did not live in Babylon, for there were many magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, and Chaldeans throughout the empire of Babylon. However, Nebuchadnezzar throws the whole batch into one category, and all must die, as in his mind, as all of them were frauds. And he was right, except for the 4 Hebrews, of whom Daniel was the chief. While Nebuchadnezzar was writing the suspicions that these wise men were frauds, and that their boasted claims were nothing but false claims, yet the death sentence for all of them was cruel. While we certainly believe in capital punishment, that is, the murderer must die because he has taken the life of another, however, these wise men were not guilty of murder, but rather of misleading. They had misled Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was absolute power as a king. In his rage, no one could stop him. Dr. W.A. Criswell had said several years ago about this scene and decree of Nebuchadnezzar. He will illustrate how much we need constitutional laws. We need boundaries. We need counterbalances. There is no such thing as a man having tremendous power and not being corrupted by it. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. John, verse 13, please. The communicating of this decree was obviously done differently than the communicating of the call of the wise men to come to the palace to give counsel to Nebuchadnezzar. In the call to the palace, the communication would be done representatively. That is, someone would tell one in charge of the group of the magicians or astrologers, etc., and they would communicate to the call to the others in the group. This explains why Daniel, an official in Chaldean, was uninformed by the Chaldeans. The other Chaldeans did not want Daniel to be included. The communicating of the death decree was done individually and not representatively. Arioch, the captain of the guard, and therefore the executioner for the king, would simply come and arrest the wise men and herd them to the execution. This accounts for Arioch's personal encounter with Daniel in the next verse. Pastor, verse 14, please. Daniel exercised excellent discretion in his speaking to the members of the Babylonian government about sensitive matters. Wisdom said that Daniel also exercised excellent discretion here as well. Especially did Daniel need to exercise discretion to Arioch, since Arioch was the captain of the guard of the king's administration as well as the king's executioner. Daniel handled the matter very wisely. Nat, verse 15, please.
He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, Why is the decree so hasty from the king?
Daniel's discussion got a very helpful reply from Arioch. This response of Arioch can easily be said to be an unusual response from the man in the situation. For Arioch, in his position as captain of the guard, would not be known as a man of compassion or lenience, but a gruff and mean man who would take a person's life without haste. However, Daniel's wise approach got Arioch to respond helpfully, for Arioch explained the whole problem which had prompted the decree. Daniel needed this explanation to know how to respond correctly to this crisis. Mark, verse 16, please.
Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he should give him time that he would show the king the interpretation.
Then Daniel went in. Daniel did not waste time. Once there was leniency on the part of Arioch, Daniel immediately went to see the king. Daniel would not let the king's interest diminish in the dream, but would see the king while the king still had a strong desire to know what the dream was. So, when Daniel promised to interpret the dream, Nebuchadnezzar would be desirous of knowing what the interpretation was and therefore give time for Daniel to seek God for the answer. Going to see the king was not without its perils, especially when seeing a despot like the Oriental kings of old. Proof of this was found in Esther's justified concern about going to see the king, even though she was queen. All the king's servants and the people of king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to be put them to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter. Courage is necessary to accomplish much in life, especially for one to live a godly life. Daniel's courage is seen repeatedly throughout the book of Daniel. Took courage to refuse the king's diet, took courage to approach the king in this situation, took courage to tell Belshazzar the meaning of the handwriting on the wall, took courage to pray to God when the lion's den beckoned for those who dared to offer a request to anyone but the king. However, righteous encouragement encourages, and Daniel had plenty of righteousness. Desired of the king that he would give him time. This was a good plea, for Daniel would use the time given by the king to pray and seek help from Jehovah God. However, this was also a perilous plea, for Nebuchadnezzar had already complained to the wise men that they were just wanting time so that in the intervening time, things would change. He, Daniel, would show the king the interpretation. This promise was both a promise of fairness and a promise of faith. This promise was fair in that the promise reciprocated the request of the king. Daniel was not selfish. He asked for time from the king, then reciprocated the favor by saying that he would interpret the dream, which meant that he would tell the dream, for one cannot interpret the dream without knowing what the dream is. Daniel would return the favor. We need to remember this practice when asking favors of others, and especially of God. If God is to bless us as we request, what we are going to do in return to show our appreciation. However, we should not try to use this method as a bargaining chip to get God to do something for us. Many do not thank God when He answers our prayers, let alone serve Him better. This promise was also one of great faith, for Daniel promised to interpret the dream before he even knew the dream. However, Daniel had great faith in God and believed God would reveal the dream to Daniel. Faith sees the work done before the work is done. Next week, we will see if God gave to Daniel the interpretation of the dream so that Daniel and his Hebrew companions and all the rest of the wise men will be saved from the execution. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you, dear Lord, for your word. We thank you, dear Lord, for what it tells us. Help us, dear Lord, to continue to dig into your word, to have a better understanding, to look to you for the decisions we need to make, to look to you for the strength and wisdom that each and every one of us need. We ask once again that you be with Brother Malugent and help him, dear Lord, with his health issues, as well as Ray Westmoreland. Watch over them, lead them, guide them, and direct them. Help the doctors with their wisdom to help them get better. We ask these things in your name. Amen. Now going to the questions. True or false? Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams in the 3rd year of his reign. 2nd year. I know you say that's a tricky question again. True or false? Nebuchadnezzar was the first Gentile to have a dream that bothered him in the Bible. False. Who was the first one? Pharaoh. When Nebuchadnezzar had his dreams, whom did he call to tell him what the dream was? Astrologers, magicians, sorcerers, or all of the above? All the above. True or false? Daniel was in the group originally called by Nebuchadnezzar to tell him what was in the dream was. False. He wasn't there. True or false? Nebuchadnezzar originally only asked for the interpretation of the dream. No, he wanted to know what the dream was. True or false? If the Chaldeans were unable to comply as asked by Nebuchadnezzar, then they would be cut into pieces and their homes would be made into a dunghill. True. True or false? Nebuchadnezzar felt that the Chaldeans were being untruthful in the interpretation of previous dreams. He had a suspicion to that, yes. True or false? The Chaldeans claimed that what Nebuchadnezzar had requested had never been asked before by any other king. True. True or false? The Chaldeans indicate that their communication with the gods was currently on hold, and that was the reason they could not interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. False. True or false? The decree to kill the Chaldeans was just for those in Babylon. It was for all of them, not just ones in Babylon. True or false? Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that he would interpret the king's dream. True. Questions or comments? Okay, well, next week we will get into the last half of Daniel chapter 2, and you are dismissed just a little bit earlier.